In today's lecture, we're going to be discussing Chapter 12, Psychopathology. We are going to be discussing a few different psychiatric disorders. There is a lot of information that you can cover when you talk about psychiatric disorders, so we are going to cover a decent amount of them, but we're pretty much only going to go into a lot of detail about schizophrenia and depression. So this is an overview of what we're doing today. So we're going to just kind of lay some groundwork for just some facts about psychiatric disorders. Who do they affect? What percent of the population? Things like that. And then we are going to get into information about schizophrenia. We'll discuss twin studies, different genes that are involved in schizophrenia. How does it affect the limbic system, the ventricles? There are abnormalities in the cortex. How do dopamine and glutamate play into schizophrenia? What is their role? The integrative model of schizophrenia. Then we're going to discuss depression. We'll look at brain changes in depression, neurochemistry. We're going to discuss a little bit about bipolar disorder and briefly some anxiety disorders, particularly focusing on a little bit about PTSD and OCD. I am going to talk about generalized anxiety disorder, phobias, panic disorder, but you could do an entire lecture on literally just one of these things. We could have just done a whole lecture on schizophrenia. You could just do a whole lecture on PTSD. So we're kind of doing a lot in one lecture. So if there's one of these that you are more interested in, I definitely suggest that you do some research on that if you have any questions. I've studied some of these before, but let's get into it. So first, we're just going to kind of talk about some different facts and information about psychiatric disorders. So psychiatric disorders are much more prevalent than you think. Epidemiological studies report that about a third of the United States have symptoms that match those of major psychiatric disorders at some point in their life. So a third of people in the United States likely, now we don't know, not all these people are diagnosed, but just from the information that we have, we see that a lot of the symptoms that they are experiencing map onto at least one different psychiatric disorder. The number of males and females who suffer from psychiatric disorders are actually equal. What is different is the proportion. So there's certain psychiatric disorders that affect more males than more females and vice versa. Males, we tend to see that they suffer more from substance abuse related disorders, whereas females, we see that they suffer more from depression. So I have this little graphic right here. This is from your book. So this prevalence is the percentage of people suffering from a disorder at any one point in time. So this is the prevalence, and this is in percentage. And then here we have by sex, by age, by race. So the greater prevalence of mental disorders in females is due mostly to a greater susceptibility to depression in women. Now, there's a lot of different information that you can get about psychiatric disorders. So on here, it's saying that more females suffer than males. But over here, I have that males are actually equal to females. If you really look at like a broad scope of the research, you'll find that there's more commonly just as many men to women. Like I said, this is just, they break down in their difference of proportion. So a lot of this like higher value right here can be because women suffer more from depression. But when you take every single psychiatric disorder and you look at whether they plague males or females, you find that it's about equal. We have episodes of schizophrenic psychosis are more common in younger adults, and mental disorders do occur in every single racial group. There is no one racial group that is immune to experiencing psychiatric disorders. A lot of the differences that you will see here in this graph, like for instance, you see that Asian individuals, it says that they have a much lower percentage of prevalence of mental disorders. Now, that could be due to a lot of different reasons. There are cultural reasons why people do not seek help. So maybe we don't even have data for them. Is it frowned upon? Is it accepted? So that's a lot of the reason why you might see discrepancies within different racial groups. Disorders they can appear earlier in life or later in life. So things like drug abuse, you kind of see a little bit earlier between the ages of like 25 to 44. Doesn't mean they can't happen younger in life. This is just kind of like the range that we see. We can definitely see someone develop some sort of substance abuse or drug abuse before the age of 25. Schizophrenia tends to appear between 25 and 44. More often than not, schizophrenia is going to be a little more like in between that 25 to 44 age range. Schizophrenia is a little bit more difficult to diagnose in younger populations, particularly populations under the age of 25, just because there's a lot of developmental things going on. We do not fully develop as human beings until we're more so around the age of 25. People used to think it was 18, but our prefrontal cortex is still developing. And because there are these developmental abnormalities associated with schizophrenia, you kind of want to wait until somebody has fully ran through the gamut of development, as one would say, before you start to diagnose something like schizophrenia. Depression tends to appear earlier in life. It's more common earlier in life, but it definitely does happen in older populations. Specifically, geriatric populations are definitely very susceptible to depression. Maybe they are alienated from their family. Maybe it's because of like their loss of independence. As you get older, you can't do as many things for yourself. Your family, they're younger, they're more lively, you can't participate in things as much. So we definitely do see depression in elderly populations. It's just that it is much more common. There's a higher incidence of it in earlier ages. Antisocial personality disorders, we see that these tend to emerge earlier in life. And there are also, like I said, some disorders that appear later. So things like cognitive impairments, of course, that has to do with like our aging brain. And then also we have things like dementia, which is a form of cognitive impairment. Alzheimer's disease is something that is going to appear later. I'm going to put on the laser pointer because this is so much more fun to do things with. Okay. So let's talk about schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a major challenge in the whole field of psychiatry. It's a very complex disorder. It affects has a lot of different symptoms. It affects a lot of different areas of the brain. And to be honest, we don't fully understand schizophrenia yet. We have found certain characteristics that we see that are consistent, but I've said this before in class, there are these disorders that people get that you would think, because we have medications and things like that we fully understand them backwards and forwards. But our systems are so incredibly complex that there are still aspects of disorders, even like depression, that we don't fully understand or we haven't fully cracked the code on. Schizophrenia is a big challenge also in how you care for people. And so we're going to get into why that is, what are the symptoms, how is it treated, what does it affect. Schizophrenia affects about 1 to 2% of the population. However, it takes a disproportionate share of community resources. So even though schizophrenia only affects 1 to 2% of the population, I mean, that's still hundreds of thousands of people, right? These people, because people with schizophrenia need so much care and so many resources, this is a disorder that disproportionately takes up a lot more resources than some other disorders. What does someone look like who has schizophrenia? So a key symptom of schizophrenia is dissociative thinking, and that is impaired logical thought. So dissociative thinking is impaired logical thought. So someone who they don't think in a logical way. They kind of like go off on tangents. They start like running with one idea and then it kind of sporadically jumps around. There, you can kind of tell that in the way that they speak. Some people, there's like a term to describe someone who speaks who has schizophrenia. It kind of sounds like a word salad. So things are just kind of tossed up and jumbled in there. Some other symptoms are auditory hallucinations, personal delusions, change in affect. So by affect, I mean mood or change in their emotion. With delusional thoughts and personalized delusions, those can be like thinking that they are someone who they're not. So we're going to talk about what specifically each of these symptoms kind of looks like, and they get broken down into two different categories. So symptoms are divided into positive symptoms and negative symptoms. So what does that even mean? Does it mean that it's good and it's bad? What does positive and negative even mean? So when we say that something is a positive symptom of schizophrenia, that means that this is an abnormal state that someone has gained. So if you're gaining something, it is being added. So therefore, that is why it has a positive sign for positive symptoms, abnormal states that are gained. So these are things like hallucinations. So before someone developed schizophrenia, they didn't have hallucinations. Now they do. It's something that they have gained by having schizophrenia. Hallucinations are actually mostly auditory. People tend to think of hallucinations as like seeing something that's not really there. And while that can definitely happen, people with schizophrenia tend to report that they are hearing voices, hearing someone talk to them, when in fact there is actually no one there present. Delusional thoughts. So these could be what we call delusions of grandeur. And delusions of grandeur would be like thinking that you are the president of the United States. So someone with schizophrenia could take on this like delusion of grandeur and think that they are someone. So there's a little picture right here. Think that they are someone that they're not, someone of really high status. That's kind of what delusions of grandeur mean. And just other delusional thoughts, just believing things about yourself that aren't actually true. You can also have disorganized thoughts. So I kind of got into this on the last slide. This is related to dissociative thinking. So your thoughts are just kind of all jumbled around. They're not organized in any sort of way. You're constantly like in this state of confusion, basically. And then you can just have overall bizarre behaviors. You can also have abnormal motor behaviors. This is more often caused by medication that is used to treat schizophrenia than the schizophrenia itself. But people can like move really suddenly. They can be very like frozen up. They can like look, make eye contact, like maybe for extended periods of time, when that's obviously not something that's socially acceptable. They can maybe like dress in a very like eclectic, off way, that again like goes against a lot of social norms. So just overall bizarre behaviors, and those can fall into a lot of different categories. So what are negative symptoms? So positive symptoms are things that are gained, things that were not there before, that someone has gained as they have developed schizophrenia. Negative symptoms are normal functions. So normal functions that you or I have, someone who doesn't have schizophrenia has, that have gone away, that have regressed, that are no longer present in that person. So a negative symptom would be something like social withdrawal. So someone who is quote unquote normal has some sort of degree of social interaction with people, whether that's virtually, whether that's in person. Right now we're doing that all virtually. But someone who has schizophrenia is definitely going to go very inward, not really reach out to anyone, not really want to have contact with anybody. we see that they have very flat affect. So what I mean by that is that they might report strong feelings, like if you did some sort of like test with them where you're asking them questions, but you cannot see it at all on their faces. So you can't really tell when they're happy or when they're sad or anything like that. They're just very stoic, very kind of, like the word suggests, very flat. Just you can't really tell what they're thinking, what they're feeling. They're not very expressive. You can have something called anhedonia, which is the loss of pleasurable feelings. So normal things that would make someone happy, bring them joy in their life, that goes away. And then they have this like anhedonia. So spending time with certain people, watching, certain shows on TV, going to certain places that brought you a lot of joy. We see that people who suffer from schizophrenia, they do not feel those pleasurable feelings that those things used to bring them. People with schizophrenia also have reduced motivation. They have very poor focus. So again, someone who's normal has like a relative level of motivation, a relative level of focus, but someone with schizophrenia, those things are going to retreat and they don't have those as much anymore. They can have alogia, which is reduced speech, so they just don't really talk that much anymore at all. Regardless of who they're talking to, they might say only a couple words. They might even not speak at all anymore. So again, that's something that was normal before that has gone away. And they can also have catatonia. So catatonia is reduced movement. There's actually a specific type of schizophrenia called catatonic schizophrenia. And that is when someone literally freezes up and will be in this kind of frozen state for really extended periods of time. They get a really rigid posture, and it can also just be it doesn't have to be that extreme. People with the normal type of schizophrenia, not necessarily catatonic, they can still just get into these kind of different postures where they're frozen, or really quick, rapid movements, just bizarre, reduced movement in general. So here are some of the pictures that I have for what some of the symptoms look like. So people have communication deficits. So alogia, they don't have as much speech in general. They don't make as many words. They have a lack of motivation, which we talked about. They have a lack of interest in socializing, so that's social withdrawal. And they also have affective deficits. So they lack a lot of facial expression. They have really flat affect. You can't tell what they're thinking, how they feel, anything like that. Schizophrenia is partly heritable, and when we say that something is heritable, that means that it is something that is passed on through genes. If it's inherited, we would see that relatives show higher incidence than the general population, and in fact, they do. And this is going to increase with how close that those relatives are. So if you have a relative who has schizophrenia, you have a higher chance, a higher incidence than the general population of developing schizophrenia yourself. And that is going to increase with how close that person is to you. So here is a graph that talks about this. So we have the general population here. So this is going to kind of increase with how related someone is to you. So then we have spouses, which those spouses are not related to you at all. Definitely not. First cousins of the third degree, uncles and aunts. These are when we're getting into second degree relatives, nieces and nephews, grandchildren, half siblings. So as you can see, this curve is slowly going up as we get to your first degree relatives. So we see children, siblings with one parent, siblings in general, dizygotic twins, your parents, monozygotic twins, and we'll talk about what the differences are between those types of twins. But in general, the more close that the relative is to you, if that relative has schizophrenia, the more likely that you will be to develop schizophrenia yourself. It doesn't mean that you absolutely 100% definitely will, but you do have a higher risk. We have looked a lot at family, twin, and adoptive studies in studying schizophrenia to kind of examine this heritable component. And we see that there is a higher incidence among biological relatives when we've looked at these studies. And this is exactly what this graph shows. It's not simply a single gene that is responsible for someone developing schizophrenia. Rather, it is multiple genes interacting together. So let's talk about some of these twin studies that have helped us in our journey of figuring out what exactly schizophrenia is. So here's just an overview on what these different types of twins are. What do we mean by when we say monozygotic twins or dizygotic twins? So monozygotic twins are identical twins. They are twins that have come from the same zygote. So when the sperm fertilizes the egg, it forms into a zygote. And what can happen is that zygote forms actually two individual embryos. So these are monozygotic twins. They are identical. Identical twins share 100% of their genes. So here is a picture. These are two identical twins. Dizygotic twins are fraternal twins. They share only 50% of their genes with each other only. That's still quite a lot of genes to share with someone. And when we say that there is a twin that is discordant for a trait, we mean that only one twin suffers. So when we say that we have a twin that we have twins that are discordant for schizophrenia, that means that only one twin suffers from schizophrenia. When we say that twins are concordant for a trait, that means that both twins suffer. So in general, for schizophrenia, we see that there's a 48% concordance for identical twins and a 17% concordance for fraternal twins. So that means that even though monozygotic twins share 100% of their genes, so identical, those are identical twins, we only see that there's 48% of twin pairs where one of them is going to get schizophrenia. We only see that 48% of the time that both of the twins get it. So why is one twin getting it more than the other if they share 100% of their genes? With fraternal twins, when we look at this 17%. So if we look at twins where either one or both of them have schizophrenia, we only see that 17% of those fraternal pairs that both of the twins get schizophrenia. So more likely you have only one twin being affected, especially for fraternal, but we even see that for identical twins. So here is a little picture. We're going to talk about kind of what the reasonings are for why there is such a discrepancy. Why don't both identical twins get it if they both share the same genes, right? So here's just a little picture. This is from your book. So these are 35-year-old female identical twins. These are 28-year-old male identical twins. And although the two members of each set of identical twins shown here have the same genes, so these two have the same genes, these two have the same genes, only the twins with these larger ventricles right here and right here, these ones are really, really big. So this is the twin with schizophrenia. This is the twin who does not. This is the twin with schizophrenia. This is the twin who does not. So only the twins with larger ventricles have schizophrenia. So why is there not 100% concordance in identical twins? Why do we only see that if we look at twin pairs and when they have schizophrenia, why only 48% of the time do both of them have it? Why are they just as likely for just one to have it as they are for both? What is the reasoning for that? So there are a lot of other factors to consider other than genes. So anytime we are talking about literally any topic in psychology, but especially in biopsych, you have to consider nature and nurture factors. Yes, there are components of genetic factors, but there are certain environments people are born into. Some people argue that there's birth order can even affect that. Even if you grow up in the same home, you might be treated differently, or you have more access to resources or less access to resources, depending on if you're born as the first child compared if you're born as the fourth child. What is the economic status of your family at the time that you're born? There's so many different factors. Do you live in a big city? Do you live in a rural town? There's so many other factors to consider. So some factors are, of course, environmental influences. So environmental influences would definitely be like the environment in which you grow up in. Where do you live? What's your access to resources? What does the world look like around you? Developmental difficulties. So these are things like low birth weight or impaired motor coordination. So are these just kind of like natural developmental difficulties that you are born with, and maybe they don't get fully resolved? Maybe, again, it plays into the environmental factor. Maybe your family doesn't have the resources to help you with those developmental difficulties. People can also develop developmental difficulties. You can be born with some of them, but others can be because you are not in an enriched environment that kind of fosters where you're supposed to progress at like each stage of your life. But of course, we have to consider the reciprocal nature of genes and environment. So what I mean by that is we have to consider how genes influence the way that you behave, which has influences on your environment. And then also we have your environmental influences influencing your behavior, and that can also help change your genes. We're capable of neuroplasticity. We are capable of our brains changing, of our connections changing. So you always have to consider how all of these factors kind of lean on each other and are influencing each other all of the time. So here we can look at environmental factors and genes that favor schizophrenia. So this is looking at the reciprocal nature of both of these. So we see genes, if you have fewer to more genes that favor schizophrenia, or if you have less environmental stress or more environmental stress. So if you have few genes that favor schizophrenia and you don't have a lot of environmental stress, you are not going to see schizophrenia happen. As you increase a little bit, maybe you have a few more genes, you have a little more environmental stress, you might get mild symptoms. So as you can see, this like kind of goes up and up to where maybe you have more genes that favor schizophrenia, but you don't have a ton of environmental stress. You might get like spectrum disorders such as autism. And then, of course, if you go to the max, if you have a lot of environmental stress and many, many genes that favor schizophrenia, the likelihood that you will actually develop schizophrenia is much higher than if you are in this category down here. So when we've done these twin studies, we want to definitely examine identical twins. We want to like tease out these factors because for all intents and purposes, these identical twins have grown up in quote unquote the same environment. They've had the same parents, the same family. So they are definitely of a lot of interest for us to look at and examine. So what factors are different in their environment? What made one twin more susceptible than the other? We have seen, this is supposed to say schizophrenic. Let's change that really quick. Schizophrenic twin. All right, so we saw that the schizophrenic twin was abnormal from birth. So if we looked at twin studies where only one twin got schizophrenia and the other one did not, what did the one who developed schizophrenia, what did they look like? They were abnormal from birth. They tended to weigh less. They had much more developmental problems than their other twin. They were a lot more submissive. They showed a lot more crying and a lot more distress behaviors. They tend to be more sensitive and vulnerable than their other twin. They had much more motor impairments. And they had abnormal eye tracking. So if you'd like show them an object, maybe you're like, oh, look, if you show something to babies, especially if it is something that's like shiny or it's like colorful, they will follow it with their gaze. And so they've done studies on twins, and they saw that the twin who ended up developing schizophrenia had really abnormal eye tracking. Maybe they can't stay with the object for as long, or it's like their eyes like shake more as they follow the object. So it looks a lot more abnormal than the twin who developed without schizophrenia. So if we have access to home movies, which we did for, not we, which researchers did for a lot of these twins, because everybody used to take home movies with VHS. So we have seen that observers and researchers can pick the schizophrenic twin from these childhood home movies. They can just observe them, look at their behaviors, and they can be like, yep, that is the twin that is going to develop schizophrenia. So which genes, we talked about how there's multiple genes, and we won't get into like a huge, epigenetic lecture because that's a little bit too high level for our class, and it's honestly too high level for me because I do not study epigenetics. But what are the genes that are responsible in schizophrenia? There are multiple, like I have said. They are scattered across 15 of the 23 chromosome pairs. So you have, every single person has 23 pairs of chromosomes. You get 23 from mom, 23 from dad. They meet together. You have 46, but you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So all of the genes for schizophrenia, we have mapped them onto 15 of the 23 chromosomes. So when I say it impacts multiple genes, I'm not kidding. I want my laser pointer back. Okay. We have seen particularly that there are these genes, neuroregulin 1 and DISC1, and they are very prominent genes that are associated with schizophrenia. You can see that in here. So transgenic mice expressing the DISC1 mutation associated with schizophrenia in humans develop very enlarged ventricles reminiscent of those people with schizophrenia. So DISC1 is a mutation that can happen on your genes. And this is the rat who has this mutant gene. This is the rat who does not. So these are the ventricles, and recall that the ventricles are the spaces in your brain where cerebrospinal fluid can move and carry substances, offer protection, all that good stuff. So if you have ventricles that are enlarged, that means that it is sacrificing like brain tissue in order to make that space. So you can think of it as, oh, like there's more fluid moving around, but really what it suggests is that there is a decrease in the volume of brain tissue. And we're going to talk about that, the ventricle abnormalities in a couple of slides. We see that particularly with these genes, they are associated with acetylcholine and GABA receptors. That is what they are very important for. So clearly these neurotransmitter systems, or lack thereof, of some of these neurotransmitter systems are associated with schizophrenia. There are paternal age risk factors. This is something that has been researched. So older fathers, for example, are more likely to have a schizophrenic child than younger fathers. Is this potentially an issue with the sperm? Are older sperm more kind of susceptible to more kind of cell divisions and mutations than younger sperm are? That is something that we are trying to look at in research. Here we go. We're going to talk about the ventricles here. So there are structural differences in a schizophrenic brain. So this is an individual who has a normal brain, does not suffer from schizophrenia, and then here is someone who suffers from schizophrenia. They have enlarged cerebral ventricles. So as you can see right here, here is where this would be someone who's normal. They're like a decent size, but they're not huge. However, you can definitely tell that there's quite a bit of size difference in the individual who has schizophrenia. It's usually particularly the lateral ventricle, and we especially see this enlarged ventricle phenomenon happen particularly in males. It's not that we don't see it in females at all, but it's more likely that we see it in males. These enlarged ventricles, we've also seen are associated with having a poorer response to different drug treatments for schizophrenia. So kind of like the more enlarged your ventricles are, the more of a poor response we have seen that person, how they will respond to treatment. There are also structural abnormalities in the limbic system for someone who suffers from schizophrenia. The hippocampus and the amygdala are smaller. These are both adjacent to the ventricles, so it kind of makes sense. We see that the pyramidal cells of the hippocampus, so these are particular types of cells that we find in the hippocampus, show a very disorganized arrangement during development. So these pyramidal cells are supposed to be organized in kind of a very particular way. We know like the normal pattern of it. However, when we look at the way that these pyramidal cells are organized, particularly during development, we see that they're just very disorganized, very scattered. So that is something prominent that we see in someone who will develop schizophrenia. There are also some structural differences with the cortex. Individuals with schizophrenia have a thicker corpus callosum, and they have a significant loss of gray matter, especially during adolescence. So you can see right here, although neuron loss is normal and part of development, because it definitely is, we go through different stages of loss and rearrangement. Our cells that aren't as strong, haven't formed as strong of connections, die off. And our body just makes more efficient neural networks. Synapses get stronger, connections get stronger, things like that. So here were the controls. So these are normal adolescents. And these are adolescents who ended up developing schizophrenia. And you can see right here, this is the average annual loss of gray matter. It goes from 0% to 5%. There is a lot of gray matter loss on the top. There's a lot of gray matter loss temporally. So that is definitely something that we very commonly see in individuals with schizophrenia. PET scans, so like this right here, show that there's a significant decrease in metabolic activity, and it helps us show the loss. So just a little picture of kind of what losing gray matter looks like. So some researchers claim that the frontal lobes are especially affected in schizophrenia. They suggest that there is this hypofrontality hypothesis, and this is stating that schizophrenia is caused by an underactivation of the frontal lobes. So your frontal lobes are really responsible for higher level thinking, higher level cognitive processes, reasoning, decision making, just to kind of remind you from when we went over this information. When we look at some PET scans of discordant twins, so again, discordant means that one twin gets it, the other one did not. We see that the twin who develops schizophrenia has significantly decreased frontal lobe activity, especially in the right hemisphere. And we also see in this task called the Wisconsin card sorting task, it's a cognitive kind of card assessment, that this task is very difficult with people who have frontal lobe damage. And we see that it is also difficult for people who have schizophrenia. So even without tapping into their brain or taking a scan, we can see, okay, so if people who have frontal lobe damage have a hard time doing this task, and we see that people who are schizophrenic have an issue with this task as well, could it be that they also have some sort of frontal lobe abnormality or frontal lobe damage? So this is examples of the Wisconsin card sorting task. So in the PET scans, the blue-green colors reflect less activation. So here we have, these are the brains of the control. Right here, there's both the left and the right side. So this is the control over here. And this is the left and right hemisphere of the person with schizophrenia, and over here as well. So the blue-green colors reflect less activation. So there's less activation back here. There's a lot more activation in the frontal lobes, just even at rest naturally without even doing anything. Individual with schizophrenia, we really don't see a whole lot going on, especially in the right hemisphere. So that's why I was saying on the last slide. It's much less activation than the controls. During the card sorting task, this little area of red, that means that there is like really a lot of activity going on there. So this area lights up more. Frontal lobe still stays really active in the controls. And in the individual with schizophrenia, there's really no activity going on in the right hemisphere and a little bit in the left. So it's very difficult for people with damage to their frontal lobes. And as we can see, it's very difficult for people who suffer from schizophrenia. Their frontal lobes are not being activated nearly as much. So how does dopamine play into schizophrenia? We've talked about how there's structural abnormalities. We have a smaller hippocampus, smaller amygdala, larger ventricles, not as much activity in the frontal lobe. We also see that there are issues with dopamine. The dopamine hypothesis suggests that schizophrenia is caused by excess levels of dopamine. Also, could be an increase in postsynaptic sensitivity. So it could be that people with schizophrenia are creating a lot more dopamine than is necessary, or another way of having more dopamine activity is having the receptors be a lot more sensitive so that they can really grab that dopamine and have it bind to the receptor so that it can produce the effects. So it could be either or. Overall, we're talking just about an increased activity of dopamine, whether it's producing more in excess or whether it is just that the receptors are a lot more sensitive to dopamine. The dopamine hypothesis comes from studies that we have done on amphetamine psychosis. So how did we even figure this out? How did us researching about amphetamines lead us to learn about schizophrenia? We see that people who use amphetamines, they have a very increased amount of catecholamines. Especially dopamine. Dopamine is a catecholamine. So amphetamines increase the release of catecholamines in someone's body. They enhance the release. If someone builds a tolerance, which we've talked about how, what's the difference between tolerance and sensitivity. So if someone builds a tolerance to a certain amount of amphetamines, of course, they're going to increase their dosage so that they can increase the effects or feel those effects. That is, of course, going to increase their levels of catecholamines all over again, especially dopamine, because amphetamines particularly enhance the release of dopamine. And what happens is we see that people who get to a certain point of increasing their dosage, say their normal dose was like 5 milligrams, people who really abuse amphetamines, we see that they can use up to like 3,000 milligrams of amphetamines in a day. So their body is just all over the place, going crazy, releasing a ton of dopamine. And what can happen to them is when you get to that level of substance abuse with amphetamines, you can develop this thing called amphetamine psychosis. And it looks exactly like schizophrenia. It's like how PCP is the drug form of schizophrenia. Amphetamines kind of can be as well. You just have to take really, really a lot of them in order to kind of see those effects. So that's kind of how we figured out that dopamine might play a role in schizophrenia, because we see these people who have these like insane high levels of dopamine from the overuse of amphetamines, and they're showing symptoms that look exactly like schizophrenia. So could it be that these people who suffer from schizophrenia are suffering from either excess amount of dopamine or increased postsynaptic sensitivity to dopamine? There are a few different ways in which we can treat. Sorry, I just lost my place in my notes. So there are a couple different ways in which we can treat schizophrenia using, if we're going according to the dopamine hypothesis, assuming that it's dopamine levels that are really to blame for a lot of these symptoms and for why people present schizophrenia. So the first drug is called chlorpromazine. It is an antipsychotic drug. It's also known as Thorazine. That's its like usual, like how fluoxetine is called Prozac. That's its like brand name. I also have another one over here called Largactil. If you treat amphetamine, these treat amphetamine psychosis and schizophrenia. So chlorpromazine can be used to treat either or, and we see a reduction in certain symptoms in both of these. So that's, again, kind of further supporting that this dopamine hypothesis could be true. We also use drugs called typical neuroleptics to treat schizophrenia, and these are all dopamine antagonists. So drugs like, this should say haloperidol. Is that how you say that? I think so. I'm double checking. Haloperidol. Let me fix that for you guys. See, just because you're recording in normal does not mean that your recording does not mean that things do not happen just like they do in the classroom. Haloperidol. Okay, so typical neuroleptics are dopamine antagonists. That means that they work by blocking dopamine receptors. So if you block the receptor for something, that means that that substance cannot exert its normal effects. I always use the example of pain medication. When you block pain receptors, that's what pain medication does. When you block pain receptors, the neurotransmitters that are in those pathways and help us feel pain and continue the cascade of action potentials from neuron to neuron, that means that those neurotransmitters are not allowing you to feel pain because they're blocked. Their receptors are blocked. So when we have a dopamine antagonist that is blocking dopamine receptors, that means that dopamine cannot exert its normal effects. And we see that these tend to work for people in relieving some of their symptoms for schizophrenia. So both of these are in favor of that the dopamine hypothesis does kind of explain part of what's going on in schizophrenia. However, there are a lot of long-term effects and problems with dopamine drugs. Dyskinesia is distortion in voluntary movement, And tardive dyskinesia is the repetitive movement of the face, mouth, lips, and tongue. So this individual down here has tardive dyskinesia. This is something that can happen to people who use dopamine drugs like typical neuroleptics, chlorpromazine, all those for extended periods of time. It's like a side effect of the drug. And clearly, it's not a very pleasant side effect, right? It's very kind of bizarre to other people. It doesn't really make people want to, come up to you, talk to you. It's very alarming to see someone exhibiting those kinds of behaviors. So it's really not a pleasant side effect of using those kinds of drugs, using dopamine-related drugs. People can develop what is known as a supersensitivity psychosis. This happens when people have chronic use of these dopamine blocking drugs, where they actually kind of start to have a sudden resurgence of positive symptoms, even when they take the drug at a very low dose. So it kind of does like a 180 on your body. When you're chronically blocking these dopamine receptors, what can happen is all of a sudden now you get super sensitized to a low dose, and you get the emergence of some of those positive symptoms of schizophrenia. This is explained also on page 357 in your book, in the little box 12.1, if you would like to read about it. It's very interesting. So like I said, you can see the emergence of positive symptoms. So supersensitivity psychosis can happen from taking these dopamine-related drugs, and you also get this tardive dyskinesia. What are some problems with the dopamine hypothesis? So we actually see that people with schizophrenia have normal dopamine metabolite levels. Their bodies metabolize dopamine just as well as somebody else's. And they produce them at like the same rate. They're producing dopamine at the same rate. It's being broken down at the same rate. So that would go against arguing for dopamine being like the real underlying cause of schizophrenia. The D2 receptors, those are the dopamine receptors that can get blocked, that the antagonists work on. Those receptors are blocked much faster than we see symptoms go away. Drugs like Prozac, fluoxetine, SSRIs, those can take kind of a while to block reuptake pumps and do what they need to do for depression. And that has a lot of reason to do with why those drugs take, 3 to 6 months in order for somebody to start feeling relief. But that's not the case with these like typical neuroleptics and these drugs that block dopamine. They block the receptors really fast. They have really high affinity for the receptors. So why do we not see the symptoms go down as quickly? That is another reason why people are not really in favor of the dopamine hypothesis. Atypical neuroleptics, such as clozapine, they don't have a super high affinity for dopamine receptors. They block a little bit of dopamine, but they also block serotonin. And we see that they are just as effective. So they block both of these neurotransmitter systems, but especially serotonin, and they're just as effective at relieving people's symptoms. And if it was totally dopamine, then why would blocking serotonin receptors also work for these people? Some atypical neuroleptics actually increase people's dopamine levels, and we still see that they are effective at relieving people's symptoms. So why would that be the case if excess of dopamine is supposed to be what is kind of driving the boat on somebody getting schizophrenia? Why would we see that a drug that actually increases those levels helps somebody? We also have the glutamate hypothesis. So the glutamate hypothesis suggests that schizophrenia is caused by an underactivation of glutamate receptors. This comes from studies on people who use PCP. We have talked about how PCP is like the chemical version of schizophrenia. PCP is an incredibly dangerous drug. we say that PCP is psychomimetic. That means that it mimics psychosis. It produces both positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So not just one or the other, it produces the whole range of symptoms that we would see in someone who has schizophrenia. So let's get back to a little bit of talk about ion channels and what's going on with all of that. So this might look familiar from our chapters, a few chapters ago. So this is an ion channel. In someone who is normal, or I don't really like to use the word normal, someone who basically does not have schizophrenia. They don't really have any psychiatric disorder. We see that glutamate is supposed to bind to this receptor called the NMDA receptor and allow calcium to flow. So this is a receptor. It has a pore for an ion channel. So glutamate, which is right here, I'm going to get the pen out, actually. Let's get the pen. What color do we want? Let's do blue. Okay. So we have glutamate right here. So glutamate comes in. It can bind to this receptor right here. And it allows calcium to flow through. So calcium is going to flow through. It's going to come inside the cell. That is in someone who is normal. So ignore that there's even this PCP thing right here. However, if someone takes PCP, let's go to green. Glutamate binds to the NMDA receptor, which that's exactly what it did before. So it's going to bind. However, now we have this PCP blocking. So this calcium tries to travel down here, but it cannot go through. That's a lovely artistic drawing. The calcium cannot go through because what PCP does is it goes deep into this little pore and it blocks any ions from moving. So glutamate stops producing its usual effects. If someone takes PCP, it stops glutamate from producing the effects that it normally would have, which is calcium being able to flow in and out of this ion channel. So, if you have prolonged NMDA receptor dysfunction, so that's exactly what we're looking at right here. This would be a receptor dysfunction. If PCP blocks this channel from being able to accept calcium, so glutamate can still bind, but this channel is not working like it should, you can get anywhere from memory loss to seeing the emergence of acute schizophrenia, just solely based on these NMDA receptors. And NMDA receptors are also specialized for acetylcholine. Schizophrenia is a combination of a lot of different factors. So we kind of were getting at this earlier, the how you can't just look at it from genes, or you can't just look at it as environment. You have to look at it as a constant kind of conglomerate of different factors: genetic factors, developmental factors, stress. And that is what the integrative model of schizophrenia suggests, is that schizophrenia is a combination of these genetic, developmental, and stress factors. Schizophrenia will develop if you have a compromised brain and environmental stressors happening at the same time. Some examples: city life, prenatal exposure to influenza, loss of oxygen at birth. So these are situations where if you kind of already have these like compromised, you already have a compromised brain, you have compromised genes, mutated genes, And then you're put into these environments. So prenatal exposure to influenza, that is an environmental factor. Losing oxygen at birth, maybe the umbilical cord gets wrapped around the child. And also city life, living in more stressful surroundings, can definitely make you more likely to develop schizophrenia if you already have these genetic factors. This is a graphic that is in your book, and it looked at children who lived in rural areas, children who lived in kind of smaller cities, and then children who moved to a big city earlier in their lives. So here's big city, small city, rural area. You can see each of three of those colors. So the children who lived in, this is done in Denmark, by the way. The children who lived in rural areas, they were taken as like a baseline. So this is like their risk of schizophrenia. We just left them at a 1. And this is the age. So as you can see, the risk of schizophrenia is higher when you move to a city earlier in your life. So between the ages of 0 to 8. So this is just a small city. So even here we see this kind of peak. And then here we have children who move to really big, really stressful cities. And again, we have ages like 0. This is like age 0. And then we have like age 3 right here. This is 6. So as you can see, when we are moving children in these kind of formative years of their life to these big cities, they have a much higher risk for developing schizophrenia than these children in rural areas or in smaller cities. So that is definitely an environmental stressor. Moving on, we are going to discuss depression. So, what is depression? Depression is characterized by an unhappy mood, loss of interest, energy, and appetite, difficulty in concentration, and restless agitation. It is most common in individuals who are over the age of 40. We absolutely see depression occur in people who are younger than 40. It is just the most common in people who are over the age of 40. We just see higher percentages. There's a lot of different factors that can play into that, maybe financial factors. You could look at like divorce rate. Also, that's we have a very high divorce rate in this country, right? It's about 50% almost. And that's kind of more so around that age where you might see those things happening. You might have a few kids then, and kids can be very stressful. Even my one puppy that I have right now, and I share the responsibilities with my parents, is very stressful. Any of you guys who are parents out there, especially during quarantine, my hats are off to you. And we also see that depression plagues women more than men. But like I said, depression can happen at any time in somebody's life. It can affect both men and women. These are just kind of general trends that we see. And depression happens in this like very vicious cycle. So it doesn't necessarily have to start at either one of these, but they all kind of feed into each other. So someone has kind of negative, depressive thoughts. They don't really see any point in trying it a lot. They don't have a lot of motivation in their life. That feeds into having just a really low mood. Then you feel guilty. You can feel discouraged, feel really inadequate, feel worthless, feel like you have no purpose in life. And then that helps feed into your behavior. If you're feeling guilty and discouraged and worthless and just really, really bad, it doesn't make you want to be super active. It doesn't make you want to engage. So then you can avoid people, you avoid situations, you socially withdraw, and then everything just kind of feeds back into each other. And it's a very, very difficult pattern to break. Depression can last for several months or even longer. What about suicide? It may lead to suicide. Of course, depression does not always lead to suicide, but it can. There is a strong hereditary contribution. There is a 60% concordance for monozygotic twins, so 60% chance that both twins are going to develop depression. And this we see in whether these twins were reared apart or together. So we are actually able to look at twins that were separated at birth, who got adopted by different families, or who were maybe raised by different members of their family, different parts. We still see that there's this 60% concordance rate. So clearly there is a very strong heredity contribution, a very strong genetic factor that plays into developing depression. We see a 20% chance in both dizygotic twins. So these are fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes. They have a 20% chance that both of the twins will develop depression. So I just wanted to discuss suicide really, really quick. These are kind of some warning signs of suicide. These are from your book. So threatening to hurt or kill yourself, or talking about wanting to do that, looking for ways, trying to access firearms, pills, talking or writing about death, dying, or suicide, feeling hopeless, feeling rage or uncontrolled anger, seeking revenge, acting reckless, engaging in really risky activities, feeling very trapped, increasing substance abuse. Social withdrawal is a huge one. Feeling anxious, trouble sleeping or sleeping too much, mood changes, seeing no reason for living and having no purpose in life. Now, just because you have maybe felt one of these things at some time in your life does not mean that you should be like, oh my gosh, that means I'm definitely going to commit suicide. That is absolutely not what this means. But these are very prominent warning signs to look out for in a loved one. If you see somebody kind of showing these kinds of behaviors, or talking about hurting themselves, or if you have felt that way yourself, we have so many resources at Golden West. You are all valuable. You are all worth so, so much. And there are a lot of people who want you to be around, and there are a lot of people who want your loved ones to be around. So these are just kind of some warning signs to look out for. And don't ever be afraid to talk to anyone about these things that are bothering you. Everybody at Golden West, the staff, and definitely myself really care about all of you. If you ever start feeling like this, you can always come to me. You can go to the health center. If you have a friend or a family member who you notice doing this, there are hotlines that you can call. And there are always resources out there. If you ever have any other questions about any of these kinds of materials, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I am happy to help you. Okay, so back to depression. There is two different kinds of depression. There's unipolar depression, and this is depression that alters with just normal emotional states, whereas there is bipolar disorder, which is depression that alternates with expansive mood or mania. So unipolar depression, it would be like, some days somebody is quote unquote normal. They can be happy, they can be sad, they can experience the range of emotions. They're not necessarily in one extreme or the other, but then there's these times where they get into this like just really dark, very sad place. They feel worthless. Whereas with bipolar disorder, depression is going to alternate with this mania, and mania can look like very, very different things. People who are in a manic phase can be very, very talkative. They can be really hyper. They can just kind of get into even different hobbies, but just in a very, very like intense way. I actually have a very close friend from college, and after we graduated college, I just saw her like on social media, like posting these huge posts about just random stuff, and it was stuff that she cared about But it was kind of out of the ordinary for her. And I ended up finding out after we, made contact after a little bit. I found out that she was actually experiencing bipolar disorder and she was in a manic phase. And during the time, I remember thinking to myself, like, oh my gosh, this looks very manic, but it's normal. It's not like she's like, going randomly skydiving or like doing all this risky behavior, but it looked off to me. So mania can definitely look very different in a lot of different people. People present mania in different ways. But that's kind of an example of what mania kind of looks like. So it's these really high highs and these really low lows. Of course, we never want to be using the term bipolar to just talk about someone who changes their mind on a daily basis. That's very rude to people who actually do struggle with bipolar disorder. You are not bipolar if you think one thing one day and think another day. So please, as much as you can, try not to use that term when your friend kind of flip-flops on maybe what they say or something like that, because bipolar really is it's a very real mood disorder that affects a lot of people. And just because somebody changes their mood or changes their mind doesn't mean that they are quote unquote bipolar. So what are the brain changes in someone who has depression? So PET scans show that we have increased blood flow to the frontal cortex and the amygdala. So as you can see right here, here's kind of a little PET scan of metabolic activity. There is a lot of activity in the prefrontal cortex and in the amygdala. We talked in the last lecture about how the amygdala is very, very responsible for fear conditioning and for feeling fear. So that does make sense in individuals who are depressed. They also have a lot of negative thoughts. So constantly a lot of inner dialogue. That could also be suggesting why the prefrontal cortex is very much lit up. We see that there is decreased blood flow to attention and language areas, particularly in the parietal cortex, right here, and the posterior temporal lobes, so in the back here. We have a monoamine hypothesis. So this is trying to describe why depression even happens in the first place. So the monoamine hypothesis, and just to remind you guys what monoamines are, they are norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, and melatonin. The monoamine hypothesis suggests that depression is the result of a reduction of synaptic activity of particularly norepinephrine and serotonin. What is the support for this? What is the evidence that we have to suggest that the monoamine hypothesis can really describe what is going on in depression? Because we see success with drugs like MAOIs, we see success with electroshock therapy, other drugs like SSRIs. We've talked about MAOIs and SSRIs before. When we see that these kinds of drugs and this kind of therapy works for people, those work on monoamine systems. So if we see that something that works on a monoamine system helps someone with depression, our logical thought would be to say, okay, well, it's definitely monoamines that are the reason for somebody experiencing depression. So recall that MAO is an enzyme that blocks monoamines from being released. So neurotransmitters can do three things, right? They can be broken down by enzymes, degraded. They can be taken back into the cell via reuptake. Or they can bind to postsynaptic receptors. So here is the MAO. Wow, that's a terrible picture. Here's the MAO enzyme right here. These are the receptors. So here's reuptake. And the earliest effective drug for depression were MAOIs, so monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And what they do is they stop this MAO enzyme from breaking down monoamines. So it eliminates this enzyme and it allows monoamines to not get broken down here inside the cell, and it allows them to continue to be released in exocytosis and bind to these postsynaptic receptors. So that is going to increase their activity. So MAOIs help increase the activity of monoamines at the synapse. The older approach to depression is electroconvulsive shock therapy. This is a therapy in which someone is hooked up to electrodes. They put something in their mouth because when you have a seizure, you bite down really hard and they don't want them to literally bite their tongue off. But it induces a seizure. And this helps release monoamines, particularly how they place the electrodes. It helps release monoamines. And we see that individuals who have undergone electroconvulsive shock therapy experience a decrease in depressive symptoms. We don't really do that as much anymore. It's a very obviously invasive way to handle depression. It can still be done, but it is done in very, very, very extreme cases. And we're starting to see new research in things like deep brain stimulation. We'll talk about some modern approaches that are a little more helpful for people and not as traumatic as being induced into a seizure. We have a method called repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, or RTMS. This helps alter the metabolism of monoamine transmitters. So again, it's helping to increase their activity. And we see that people who undergo RTMS experience a decrease in depression and depressive symptoms. So this is what RTMS looks like. You have this little magnetic coil, and it creates magnetism in an electrical field on the brain, and it helps alter the metabolism of monoamines, increases their activity, and we see that people have a relief in depression. We also have deep brain stimulation. This is where we surgically implant electrodes into someone's cingulate cortex. Remember, the cingulate cortex is particularly responsible for helping us experience pain. Depression can definitely cause someone mental pain. That's called psychache. Mental pain is a real thing. We see individuals with depression, the pain pathways in their brain are much more active than someone who does not have depression. So deep brain stimulation can also be very helpful. Both of these methods we see a lot of success with, but they are incredibly, incredibly expensive to do, and not a lot of insurance companies cover these kinds of treatments. So that is why you don't really hear about them as much. This equipment is really expensive. Obviously, like, there's an invasive aspect to deep brain stimulation, but hopefully in the future we can see that these can be used a lot more often. You also have to remember that pharmaceuticals are also a business, and they are a business that does not want to go by the wayside. There is billions of dollars in the pharmaceutical industry, so that also plays a role, without me getting on a total tangent about that. But these are just things that you want to be thinking about in being someone who is a conscious consumer of research and of treatments and all of these things. There's always other factors to consider about, oh, well, if this helps a lot of people, then why aren't we using it? There's always layers to things, financial, business, societal, all of the above. But we do see success with these, and hopefully in the future they will be used a little bit more, especially RTMS, because this is really non-invasive. Some other modern approaches to depression is cognitive behavioral therapy. This cognitive behavioral therapy tries to break this cycle like we talked about before. It can either direct somebody's thoughts, somebody's behavior, someone's mood. People engage in different behavioral exercises or thought exercises, and the idea is that once you impact one part of this cycle, you will therefore start to impact the whole chain of events that happens. and everything will start to move in a more adaptive, less depressed way. Cognitive behavioral therapy really tends to focus on breaking someone's negative thinking patterns. It really promotes the increase of interpersonal relationships, building more interpersonal relationships, strong ones. And we see that CBT is actually just as equal as SSRI treatment effectiveness. We see a group of people who has taken SSRIs and a group of people who have undergone CBT, which is obviously it's a talk therapy. It's a form of talk therapy. And you kind of get like homework assignments to do, but you're not taking a pill, you're not taking a medication. And these are just as effective as one another. So it's kind of cool that we can see that something is just as effective as taking something that changes our brain for us. We have the power to do that ourselves, with help, of course. We see that people who are on a combination of SSRIs and CBT, they do even better. That seems to be kind of like the holy grail combination for people with a drug and a therapy combo is SSRI and CBT. What is widely used as a modern approach are SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, MAOIs, which we already talked about, and tricyclics. So another kind of theory about why depression occurs is to discuss a serotonin deficiency. So serotonin deficiency is also important in depression. SSRIs are antidepressants that block the reuptake, of 5-HT, which we know is serotonin. So right here, all the time, our body is releasing neurotransmitters. It can release serotonin, and serotonin, some of these molecules won't even get the chance to bind, and they will instead start to travel kind of more to the outside of the cleft, and there's a little reuptake pump right here that acts as a little vacuum, and it sucks back up different neurotransmitters. So in this case, we're talking about SSRIs. So if you block this reuptake channel, that means that this little SSRI molecule now kind of doesn't really have any other choice, but it will ideally eventually go and bind. So you're increasing the likelihood that more serotonin will bind to its receptors, therefore increasing the effects of serotonin. Some problems with this. So an example of an SSRI is Prozac. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Prozac. Some problems with this is that there is a very long lag time in blocking these reuptake pumps. It takes kind of like a few months for your body to adjust and for this to happen on enough of a widespread area in your body for you to start to see relief and start to see effects. For some people, it does not help at all. Not everyone is cured or even helped. There are some people who just do not react well to SSRIs. And it actually is associated with an increased risk of suicide in children and adolescents. So that's a really big problem with SSRIs as well. They can be extremely helpful for people, for sure, and you really don't know until you take the drug itself. Having a psychiatric disorder or a mood disorder or any of the above can be extremely frustrating because it is really kind of a game with yourself in your biology to see what drug works for you if you do go the route of trying drugs. I know my friend who's the one who found out that she had bipolar. It took her a good year and a half, almost 2 years to really nail down which drug worked really well for her and made her feel like the most normal. She didn't have a lot of weight gain or other random side effects that really worked with her body. And if you're someone who ever has to try medication in your life, it can be incredibly, incredibly hard to be patient about that, but just know that you are not alone. It is very normal to have to try multiple medications to see if they help you. So depression, like I said earlier, definitely affects more women than men. This may reflect patterns of help seeking. So women are definitely more likely to seek help, and therefore they are more likely to get diagnosed if they're seeking help more. It may have some sort of social explanation, such as social discrimination. So, kind of that whole like, oh, you're a man, tough it out kind of mentality. That can be another reason why more women are diagnosed. Is there a gender difference in endocrine physiology? Yes, there definitely is a difference in the physiologies of men versus women. We each have all the same, like steroids, and I talked about that in the lecture about sex, but we differ in our proportions. So there is a little bit of a different endocrine physiology to consider, but we just don't know if that's really the determining factor in why more women suffer from depression than men. Moving on to bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is very, very poorly understood. We see it very often it's equally as often in males as it is in females. So we have an equal diagnosis when we look at sexes. It is characterized by an alternating period of depressed and manic phases. So you see symptoms of depression when you're in the depressed phase, and then you see manic symptoms in the manic phase. So like I said, you see depressed symptoms in the depressed phase. In the manic phase, you can see things like euphoria, overactivity, talkativeness, and increased energy, grandiosity, so like this I can do anything attitude, I can conquer the world. So that is kind of what my friend was exhibiting on social media when I was like kind of concerned if she was in a manic phase. It just seemed like this just like really high energy, really like grandiose thought pattern. So that is what mania looks like, more than just somebody like, I feel like mania gets a rap for being like somebody is like ripping up like a bunch of papers and going around like Tasmanian devil. It doesn't necessarily look like that. It can just look as somebody who has just like a lot of energy, a lot of euphoria. They're just really overactive. They're really hyper. So like I said, bipolar is an alternating period of depressed and manic phases. And we say that it is in cycles. So cycles of depression, cycles of mania. Depression and mania. It goes in a constant cycle. The rate at which someone cycles definitely varies. We consider someone rapid cycling if they can go in through 4 or more cycles in 1 year. So 4 or more alternating cycles of depression and mania. So depression, mania, that's one cycle. Depression, mania, that's another cycle. So 4 or more of those in 1 year, we would consider someone as rapid cycling. Some people can cycle up to several times in 1 day, so you can imagine how exhausting that is to have that level of cycling. Cyclothymia is a milder form of bipolar. So someone can cycle between dysthymia, which is mild depression, and hypomania, which is just kind of relative increased energy. So that's kind of a sub-milder form of bipolar. In bipolar disorder, we also see that individuals have enlarged ventricles. And what about treating their depression, treating their bipolar depression? What does it look like? How do we treat these individuals? I'm forgetting who I put up here. Carrie Fisher, hello. So if any of you guys are Star Wars fans, Carrie Fisher was the original Princess Leia. She is a very beloved actress. She is was a philanthropist. Just a really overall really cool person. And she is a famous individual who has suffered from bipolar disorder. So how do we treat bipolar disorder? We actually treat bipolar with lithium, and lithium is a mood stabilizing drug used to treat bipolar disorder, and it interacts with your circadian clock. We actually found lithium by accident, and you can read about that on page 368. We thought that individuals with bipolar disorder suffered from having too much of this substance called urea in their circulation. So what did we do? We injected urea into guinea pigs, thinking that it would make them manic because we wanted to test this on animal models. So we're trying to see, okay, if urea is really like the reason, then if we inject it into these animals, we should see that they become manic. So we actually saw that we could dissolve higher concentrations of urea if there was urea and lithium. So what they ended up doing with these guinea pigs is they injected them with this combination of urea and lithium. And what we saw is that it actually made the guinea pigs very calm. And they were like, why is this? So they figured out that it was the lithium. And then they started to test it on humans. And they were like, oh, wow, the lithium really calms people too. And it's totally safe to use. It's a very safe element to use. So it's found by complete accident. And that is actually how most of the drugs that we have used today were found by accident. They were not found for what they were intended to, but that's like a whole different tangent I could get on. Now we're going to end our lecture with talking about anxiety disorders. So anxiety disorders are characterized by recurrent panic states and persistent anxiety. Phobic disorders are a type of anxiety disorder. They are characterized by intense irrational fear, specifically centered on an object, an activity, or a situation in which that person has to avoid. So you can have aerophobia, which is the fear of being on an airplane. You can have arachnophobia, which is the fear of spiders. You can have agoraphobia, which is the fear of social situations, social crowds, more so anywhere where there's like a lot of people in a public place. Trypanophobia, that is the fear of needles and injections. Cynophobia is the fear of dogs. And acrophobia, the fear of heights. So in each of these situations, the person is trying to avoid whatever their phobia is about, and it causes them a lot of intense irrational fear. Someone could literally have a phobia about water, deep water, thalassophobia. That is what that one is. Someone can have phobias about cars. There's some that are more common than others, and some that kind of make sense, like arachnophobia. Most people are kind of scared about spiders. But someone who's just generally scared about spiders does not have a full-blown phobia. Phobias are very different. Someone who has a phobia for spiders will go to excessive lengths to keep their home extremely sterile, maybe everything the same color so that they're able to like see if a spider is ever there. They might get their house sprayed like once a month for spiders. And then if even anybody starts talking about spiders, they can start to feel this intense anxiety. So that's very different from somebody who just has a general fear of spiders. There's also panic disorder, which is characterized by recurrent attacks of intense fearfulness. And individuals with panic disorder, we also see that they have temporal lobe abnormalities. We've looked at this in different MRIs. They have also enlarged ventricles. So enlarged ventricles are associated with a variety of different psychiatric disorders. There is generalized anxiety disorder. This is characterized by persistent excessive anxiety. So as you can see here, things like restlessness, fatigue, excessive anxiety and worry, increased muscle aches or soreness, impaired concentration, irritability, difficulty sleeping. Also, this is kind of unrelated, but I really like this website, Very Well Mind. It has a lot of really good, sound, research-backed information on it. So for any of you who are interested in any of these disorders in a little more detail and you want to look beyond your book, this Very Well Mind is great. There's also just, in general, you can find information on a lot of different topics, so I highly suggest checking out that website. So generalized anxiety is persistent excessive anxiety. It can last for months or longer. The treatments for it, for virtually many anxiety disorders, including generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder, a lot of times they are treated with benzodiazepines, which are anti-anxiety drugs. They are anxiolytics. We have learned about benzodiazepines. It would be a good idea for all of you to refresh yourself on these drugs by going back to our lecture in which we talked about drugs, just because I'm not going into a ton of detail of them here because we kind of already talked about them before. And what benzodiazepines do, just to remind you, is they increase the activity of GABA. Your body thinks when you take benzodiazepines that you are ingesting GABA. Benzodiazepines in the body look molecularly exactly like GABA, so it can bind to GABA receptors and therefore increase the effects of GABA. And remember that GABA is the most inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it's associated with a lot of calm, very kind of restful behaviors, very still. Makes sense that we would treat somebody with anxiety disorders with something that enhances GABA, because somebody who has anxiety disorders is very heightened, has very excessive anxiety, very fearful, very just on edge, and we want to bring that person down. We want to relax them and bring down that irrational level of excitability. We also have PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. This is when someone has had an exposure to a terrifying event. This could be abusive violence. It could be they saw somebody die. There is combat fatigue or shell shock. PTSD is extremely common in individuals who have been deployed. In veterans, we see a lot of PTSD, but anybody could develop PTSD. It doesn't even mean that something traumatic has to happen to you. You could see something traumatic happen to someone. You could see someone commit suicide by walking on a train track. Say you're at the beach, you're in San Clemente at the pier station, and you see that happen. You could develop PTSD from that. You could see a child being abused, or absolutely you could be abused yourself. A child can develop PTSD from seeing their parents be in an abusive relationship. So there's a lot of different ways in which in which we would kind of categorize what a terrifying event is. It could be something that is vicarious, so you doesn't necessarily happen to you, or it can be something that definitely does happen to you. PTSD is characterized by recurrent distressing memories of the terrifying event itself. Very intense psychological distress is shown at the exposure to different cues. So, for instance, someone could, let's see, what example do I want to use? Say that someone saw their parents when they were younger. Someone saw their parents being very physically abusive with one another. And say that one of the person who was the abuser very often used a specific object to abuse the other person with. Say maybe it was a spatula or a belt or something like that. So what could happen with the person who develops PTSD is that they get very uncomfortable around things that remind them of that event. So they could see belts. They could be walking around in a store and see a belt rack and just immediately kind of start to feel very uneasy and feel very stressed out. So that would be a cue. And so people who have PTSD develop really, really strong reactions to the cues of their terrifying event that they experienced. They have random flashbacks of their event, often while they sleep, or it could literally be in the middle of the day. It doesn't necessarily have to be while you are asleep. You could just be walking around and all of a sudden you just get a flashback to this very traumatizing event that happened to you. PTSD is very exaggerated by stress, or it's exacerbated by stress. So when individuals with PTSD are under a lot of stress, just from normal life struggles, tackling 5 classes while you're in quarantine, trying to juggle just life's demands, stress like that can exaggerate PTSD symptoms from showing themselves. 19% of Vietnam vets suffer from PTSD. We see that 35% or higher rates are if they were in a high war zone. So we see that 19 go to 35% if that person was in a high war zone. We see that the right hippocampus of individuals with PTSD is smaller. They have decreased levels of cortisol, but they have increased sensitivity. So even though they have lower levels of cortisol, we see that they're very sensitive to these levels of cortisol. They could be feeling this cortisol more. That's what sensitivity means. PTSD is very strongly linked with a fear conditioning component. And this is talked about on page 371 in your book. I'm so sorry, my dog's barking. Okay, we're back. Sorry, my dog was freaking out. It is dinner time for her. Okay, so individuals with PTSD, we see that they have lower levels of cortisol. So what that suggests to us and what we've kind of researched is that they are very, very sensitive to cortisol. So they don't need kind of these higher levels of cortisol in order to feel its effects. They feel it even more so than your average person. So these lower levels are enough for them to really feel the effects of cortisol. So what can happen if you have PTSD is that there is a constant activation of this circuitry in your brain that is associated with this fear conditioning. So you've been conditioned to this event, and you have these flashbacks, you have these constant thoughts about it. So you're constantly activating this trauma system in your brain. And then that plays into you being super sensitive to cortisol, and cortisol is implicated in those pathways with fear conditioning. So then it becomes, when these pathways are constantly activated, it becomes a lot harder to forget. So that's kind of biologically what can be happening with individuals with PTSD. Lastly, we are going to discuss OCD. Also, if you have any questions about this, it is on page 371 in your book. There is a whole chart that I didn't want to put on here because it kind of gets a little bit complicated, but it is very, very interesting. So that's page 371 in your book. So lastly, obsessive compulsive disorder. OCD is characterized by repetitive rituals, persistent thoughts where you cannot stop thinking about something, and obsessions. So these are recurrent thoughts that invade your consciousness. Example, fear of germs or dying. So someone could so right here, contaminations, obsessions with cleaning compulsions. So their repetitive ritual might be that they they have to spray the countertops with antibacterial cleaner like a certain number of times every day. The rituals that are repetitive, they're usually associated with a number of times until that person feels safe. They're constantly thinking about how dirty everything is, how many germs can be invading surfaces. They can't stop thinking about it. And it becomes an obsession that just invades their thought process at all times. Dying. Somebody could have this, their OCD could be surrounded by these feelings of death and dying. So they have these thoughts, oh my God, I'm going to die. I don't want to die. Everybody dies, but what if I die early? Their ritual might be that they take like a certain amount of vitamins like every single day at certain times because they want to like build their immune system, or they literally don't go out of their house because they don't want to put themselves into harm. So those are kinds of examples of OCD. Hoarding is also one. Symmetry with ordering compulsions is another. So someone could have an obsession with things being very symmetrical, things being in color coordination. Just because you like color coordination doesn't mean you have OCD. But if something is not color coordinated in the way that it should be, it would cause you like complete panic. That would be someone who has OCD. So they're constantly obsessed with having everything neat and organized, everything in like color and symmetry combination. Their ritual is to constantly reorganize, and it's just something that plagues their life. Compulsions are behaviors over and over again. So checking the door lock multiple times. Some people have to check a door lock like 20 different times before they feel safe that the door is actually locked, before they leave the house. Washing your hands repetitively. So someone who has a contamination obsession, that would be their compulsion. So I have here checking the door lock, washing your hands. OCD affects 4 million people. There's definitely a genetic predisposition that we see in OCD. We have seen that exposure to infection, especially in childhood, makes someone more likely to develop OCD. It peaks between the ages of 25 and 44, and we see that OCD responds to treatments like SSRIs, which an example of SSRI is like Prozac. This is the same as depression, of course. SSRIs were originally marketed to treat depression, but they help people with OCD. OCD shows also a lot of success with cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not that if you have OCD, you are never going to break it. You are always going to live with it. We see a lot of success with talk therapy, and just like with anything, if you have the right drug combination with talk therapy, we see that those people are really helped. Deep brain stimulation can really help individuals with OCD, but like I said, this is sometimes difficult for people to access. Deep brain stimulation is not something that is super widely offered for a lot of different reasons. There is a really good table in your book on page 372 that helps kind of decipher between obsessions and compulsions. So obsessions, remember, are the thoughts associated with OCD. So let's go back here. Obsessions are the thoughts, the compulsions are the behavior. So the obsession could be lucky or unlucky numbers, and the compulsion for that would be like actually avoiding numbers that are associated with that. So the behavior could be like when you're parking in a structure that has numbered slots for where you park your car. That person could be like, oh, I can never park in the slot that says number 12 because that's an unlucky number. So the obsession is with the numbers, those are the thoughts, and the behavior is that they will never park their car, or they will never wear a jersey or anything like that that is associated with what they consider an unlucky number. And that is all I have for you today. I know that this lecture was longer, but there's a lot of information here to learn about psychiatric disorders. I think that this is one of the most interesting chapters that we go over. I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and as usual, please let me know if you have questions.